thank you very much indeed for taking your seats so quickly. We have two excellent speakers now to take us up to lunchtime, starting with John Bailey. John originates from Ireland. He spent most of his time since 1979 in France. He trained and managed farms in New Zealand, as well as many seasons of herding cattle in the mountains of the Pyrenees and the Alps. So real international experience and passion and enthusiasm John is going to bring to our session this morning. He runs a grazing management consultancy called Patterson's, if I've got that right.
Good enough.
It covers all of France as well as some parts of the UK, and John, we look forward to what you have to say to us.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Good. The actual pronunciation is Patterson's in French. It just means pasture sense. And I had a go back to what Michael mentioned at the very talking about light bulb moments was with technical grazing. I've always been a bit passionate about grazing because my first boss was a very good grazer and taught me a lot. Then I was working in the mountains for a number of years, and then for reasons that are mysterious, I went to New Zealand and did a techno grazing course in '94. Got inspired by Harry and the whole thing. The guy's doing over a ton of carcass a year, and the Irungi trials from Massey University, and many things led me to get more and more interested in the whole thing. So I'm not going to talk about myself, there's no point in that. And I put my glasses back on and get into it. They've asked me to talk about the principles of better grazing management. So that's what I'm going to try to do. It's quite ambitious to try to deal with this in such a short time. I got these two animated GIFs up here. It's only really just to try to hypnotize you, just to try to show you visually what's happening between a winter rotation, long rotation with single mobs, less requirements, faster rotations through the mainly grass production phases. And then sometimes I see that I work mostly in France, and I see that you can go through a whole lot of talk and then at the end realize that people didn't really click on to, what are we talking about? What is it that we're talking about? So I think it's easy to just go through basic things, and I'd like to start by apologizing to people in the sense that some people know plenty about this already, so I'm saying what you already know, and so you'll just apologizing for being boring. So what are we talking about? High animal production comes from high quality feed and feeding, nutrition. All animal production really comes from nutrition. High quality feeding comes from good quality pasture and maintaining and knowing how to manage it. High quality pasture requires deep and healthy rooting, and being as I'm into the principles bit, if anything can wear off the meat during the day, it might be that you'd start getting very curious and start looking at roots and look at the plants much closer, because it's the plants that are making you the money. And high quality plant root masses need good healthy soil, which we call the engine room. And what is it's crucial to understand is you can't have one without the other. You can't extract anything from that equation there. You'll need those four elements. Pull one out, the rest don't work anymore. And you can't do any of that if you're incapable of managing the swards and the grazing. So that's the absolute beginning of it, kind of thing. Just a little photo to maybe inspire or at least show people what the potentials are. Left-hand photo is dairy bulls in Onga in the Hawke's Bay in New Zealand at Jamie Gunson's place. And those boys, they run as him and his manager Charlie, they run 3,000 bulls together, and those boys were running over 2.5 kilos when we were there. These lambs on the right hand side are 15-week-old lambs, and they were running somewhere around 400 grams per day. This is all management. In France, cross Salias, cross Charolais, heifers, and we had weights back from them, I think it was yesterday morning, from one of the weighing sections on one of the farms, and they're running over 2 kilos. Now these, you know, you have to look at it and understand what they're feeding. It's hardly surprising if they're getting that quality feed every day being renewed. It's hardly surprising that their performances are right up there. We're talking about very good nutrition. And Trevor will be taking over from me, and we work an awful lot with Trevor, and we're pretty well kind of like dependent on Trevor for anything scientific knowledge about animal performance, the whole physiology of animals, and you know, he's taught me so much about nutrition, and high nutrition counteract so many things that drag performance down anyway, such as parasitism. It's worth mentioning. So just to present these principles, just to say quickly, run across it quickly, we kind of put it into 3 bits. There's the natural principles, what makes all of these things happen, interact and work so well. We call that the motor. There's the management principles, which is how can we go about setting something up so that we can actually master all of that, manipulate it, and harvest out from it. We tend to call that the mechanical controls, the steering wheel, pedals, etc. You'll see what I mean as we go along. And the third part is what we tend to call learning to drive. And you now have the tool, you now have the means to go out there, and you're in control, you're in command, and now you need to know how to manipulate it, how to develop strategies and planning, because plans are good. Going to the natural principles, the motor. There's a marvelous book that was published in 1957, The Productivity of Grass, by a Frenchman, French dairy farmer called André Grazing. And he actually starts with this business of trying to draw our attention to what we're really looking at, what we're trying to do. And so I'm really just stealing from André Grazing, the opening of this book. And nature and evolution spent several million years getting a little model together, and the plants evolved with the ruminants. Those plants need to be eaten, and within a certain set of conditions, one complements the other. It's quite important to realize as well that the parasites also developed with the prairial species, the sward species as well, and the animals. It's good to get an eye on that, just to realize that it all comes from nature. We're not changing anything. All we're trying to do is try to enhance it and put it into a fixed situation on a farm. Natural ruminants are migratory animals. They go north, they go south, they go up, they go down. Basically what they're doing is this optimal palatability, digestibility zone here. They're going to go through and they're going to eat at that zone there, because that is the best stuff, and that's where they're really going to get strong and healthy and have a lot of kids and everything like that. And then they're just going to keep on moving. They'll be pack grazing, shoulder to shoulder practically, and they'll just keep on moving, and they won't come back to that same spot till we've got back to that optimal zone. That's what good grazing management is really about. Just trying to get a farm into a model tool that you can do that with. So we'll have to see afterwards if everything I say is pretty well incomprehensible. I realised listening to Richard earlier on that nobody understands me.
You're with you so far.
I am. It's encouraging. Okay, and the kind of natural principles, the one that's the most important and the beginning one is this optimal zone of palatability and digestibility. Being the capacity, the potential of the plants that make up the sward, where you were talking about in your farm, anybody's farm, that zone there will always be the one that we should be consuming. It's figurative in the diagram because the zone isn't quite the same for a sheep, it isn't quite the same for dairy cattle or beef or certain management situations. But basically, that's the idea. We'll never overgraze, we won't undergraze, so we won't go to seed. Somebody who could farm his whole life way through without having gone to seed, well, they'd still get dead and buried anyway, but it would have been a marvelous thing to do. So in that optimal palatability and digestibility zone, there is where you have the major part of dry matter density. If they're eating that down, if they're just dropping that down, and you're getting the most rounds, so the most production from the year from using that zone as well, you'll have high tillering, and you will have basically perpetual plant populations. If you never had the slightest incidence with a bad year or something went wrong somehow, basically, if you manage a sward right, and the Arirungi Trails in New Zealand were an absolutely fabulous establishment of this truth. They started, I think it was in 68 through to 86, they produced over a ton of carcass of bull per hectare per year. At the outset, I think they had 57% ryegrass or whatever it was, and 30-something% clover. And on the 16th year, or whatever it was, the sward makeup was identical. Nothing had changed. So that's what I mean by this business of, if we stay in that zone, we should be able to avoid compaction and everything. We'll have healthy plants, deep rooting, a soil that is actually springy and aerobic. That's the idea. High palatability feed value. That will naturally select the highest potential sward species, because it's the way nature set it up, will be favorized, and there is a probability of what this ghastly word auto-fertility, which is really autonomy, autonomy. What we're saying is that if you have over 30-35% legume, and if you do mob grazing, what happens is you have a very, very homogeneous and even dispersal of fecal matters and urine, and so basically you have a very good fertility cycle happening. So that's the most important one, is to graze within that. Now, I mean, that's easy to say, isn't it? Less popular, overgrazing. Let's just say definitions of overgrazing. The first one is like overstaying. It's just keeping on, set stocking, just keeping on chewing on the plants as they're trying to get through and get up and kind of express themselves. Overstaying, as the Kiwis say. Depriving the plants of too much of their solar panels for photosynthesis, thus compromising their productivity, and more than often stunting them and their potential productivity, at least on a short-term basis. Graze too hard, they'll come back slower. The second, you're coming back around too fast instead of waiting. Where we are on the grass curve, and we'll be seeing this in a couple of minutes, if where we are on the grass curve tells us that we should be on a 20-day round or a 20-day, if we're coming back in 15 days or 14 days, we're hitting those plants before they stabilize the sugars. That's no good either. So, I mean, I call that punching the poor plants when they're down. And staying too long. Important to realize that none of this is religious. It's just the guidelines. It's the rules that I think it's useful to know. The more productive sugared grasses, ryegrass, the fescue, will actually be starting to reshoot, regrow after 72 hours. If you're still there, if the animals are still on 72 hours, they are actually starting to chew into the regrowth, and that's not much good for the plants either. The important thing to realize is what we're doing to the plant when we overgraze it. If we deprive it of its solar panels, or we get it too early before it's been able to stabilize its sugars, if we start cropping it before it's as it's trying to grow back, what we do is we deprive the plant of its means of kind of thriving And so it goes back on what I call it, you put in the plant on its back foot, it has to go plunge back to its resources in the crown of the plant, to its own reserves. And so basically it won't develop. And you'll get root thatch. You won't get plants going down, you'll get root thatch. Basically they just try to survive all the time. It's the best they get. And so those plants won't be very vigorous. You'll be able to see strange things like right angle root syndrome, very, very common. Lots of people can see it, and I think it's a good idea to learn to look beneath the ground, because it's really what's making you a living. And so here I've got, can you see? No. Okay. That's a really nice entry. That's a pretty healthy residual. So here we get it right, kind of thing. And there's a bit of truth about this whole thing about the evolution, because there's a funny coincidence, which is if somebody calls me up and they say, listen, we just weighed, we're not getting the weights that we were hoping to get, have you send me a couple of photos of your entries and your residuals. If your residuals are not as high or as healthy or as good as they are, that'll be why you're not getting the animal production either, because they've been underfed. And so there's this kind of joining thing of, if you're taking your residuals down too low, you're hurting the plants and you're hurting the animals too. So both are working against you. And there's just a photo, kind of almost regret having put it there, of horrific overgrazing, but it's an overkill. I shouldn't really put that there. Okay, undergrazing, which I couldn't remember the word for evil, so I wrote it in French, mal, but that's evil. So undergrazing is a lesser evil, and you basically undergraze more or less systematically, because sometimes you have to cut some stuff out, or you want to make hay and things like that, which means undergrazing is you're just letting the stuff grow back up. And sometimes it's a requirement of management, but it is useful to understand what you need to know in terms of its downsides. Some people kind of hope for too much. Tall sward is just maintenance nutrition at best. Grazing plant swards only age if they can go to seed. This business of these swards that would stay perpetually young if you could manage them perfectly perpetually, that goes out the window when plants go to seed. So it is necessary to do hay, for instance. It is necessary to put aside, because the season is just going too fast, not enough stock to control it, don't know what to do. Stick some aside, and so it does happen. It's just useful to understand. If you do it frequently, what you're going to get. Undergrazing tools. Lays will age this way, and then the easiest way to understand that is that repetitive tall growing pastures, if you pampas and things like that, if you don't feed it and if you don't graze it, it'll just go back to bushes and then it'll go back to forest. It's a natural evolutionary process, and the legume in soil will then go to a mulching humus cycle, and that's the end of it. Last one, 3. You can't expect to maintain legumes in tall growing grass or dominant tall growing grass. They need light. And so I quite often see farms where there's not much legume, but there's plenty of phosphorus. They have good phosphate, also P levels, and look, there's all the reasons are there. There should be, most of the legume seeds live between 25-50 years in the soil. They should be there. In fact, it's just because that has constantly been grown high, and they've just been basically eliminated out. Because I put in there legume equals light. So, like, really, I was tickled to hear earlier said, you know, how important at the moment with the grass is, you know, am I going to lose this damn thing? You do have to eat it down. And where we were yesterday on the farm that we saw yesterday. I was actually tickled to see that it had been eaten down. If you do a half job, it's just going to blow up in your face. It'll get away from you. Roots. I come up with fancy phrases like the concealed truth of successful and profitable grazing management. You don't have to listen to this. This photo is from MLA Meat Livestock Australia. Did a marvellous survey, can't remember when, a few years ago, off of tens or hundreds of farms, and they were looking at roots from different grazing regimes. And well, it speaks for itself, doesn't it? I mean, here on the left-hand side here, that's overgrazed, or it may just be also just plants that are fed from the top, or both. But anyway, that is overgrazed. That's what you get. You can go and see it in your own place or next door neighbour's place, anywhere. You can go and see it. Very, very easy. Very well grazed and managed plants. This is what will happen. They'll go down. And then undergrazed we tend to have the same thing of very, very superficial rooting. I should mention at this juncture that one of the good things, and a lot of what the techno grazers and just good grazers in general see, is that when they get plants that drop their roots further into the soil, they're getting plants that are exploiting a deeper layer of the soil. Some of the animal health problems become far less prevalent, and it's simply because the plants are far more stable in minerals. So rooting is good for animal performance as well. It doesn't sound right, does it?
5 minutes, John.
5 minutes, okay. Okay, here we got nodules on, we haven't got much time, so I'll just keep on racing now, and so we're just looking at more roots, nodules, nodular activity. I literally didn't say anything about soil, it's just the engine room, because there isn't time to get into it. Just a couple of pretty photos. Management principles, the thinking bit of the management principles, farm the plants with the animals, not the other way around. Plant husbandry comes first, that's what's making you money. The whole grazing management principle implies going from being subjected to by all the variables to being in control. So you have to get the tooling to be able to be in control, and then you'll get good. And it's quite easy. Why do we use a pasture curve? Well, simply, I mean, can you imagine being able to build a strategy or be able to plan or do anything if you didn't even know what kind of resource you had and when and how? So you need to work on curves. They're far less mysterious than people think. Most farms have several. Don't have much time for that. You need a paddock structure where that actually becomes a tool that you can use and profit from and manipulate and maneuver. This is where we'll be this afternoon, just quickly thrown into a CAD thing here. That's a very, very good grazer in South Island, New Zealand. James Costello, call him Cos. Excellent, don't have the time to talk about him. That's one of the farm structures, one of our kind of like, if you like, reference farms, if we had to say that word. In France, that's beef and sheep. On that's all subdivided. Just quickly mention the fact that it is very important to have distribution lines. When you work with Kiwis, I've worked in New Zealand for a while. If you've worked on a farm with lanes, it changes everything. And some people, they say, oh, well, how come is it you guys are running 1,200, 1,400 cattle per person? It's because you got a tool that you can do it in. It's quite easy. Fences cost a hell of a lot less than people think in terms of per hectare. But there are lots of astucious fences and good ways of doing water. It's important to say that it's not always necessary to subdivide everything, although people tend to think so. This is a farm in Wales. What has been subdivided here was all for dairy cattle. But the actual sheep part, in fact, needed very, very little modification. It just needed changing of the ways that he was using his mobs, and he could actually manage the grass much better. So it's not, you don't have to go out there and spend a lot of money. That's a techno system, that's a techno grazing in New Zealand. We've put a hell of a lot of money, a little company, Pasture Sense, into building a computer tool because I just got sick of handing around spreadsheets that people couldn't use. And so very quickly, you have these lines, that's the requirements you're planning at this point. That's the requirements, that's your grass curve, there's just on a block, that's the whole farm summary of all of these things. There's a whole page in there that you can just fill out in simulators and just check out anything at all. You can fill in, get your dry matter costings, find out how much it costs you, and it'll end up giving you this magic figure, which is margin per kilo of dry matter or per hectare. Don't have time for any more on that. It also gives you the means to just throw in a conjectured thing, or where you are on the grass curve. It's going to tell you how much they will need per day in terms of what you're going in at, what you're coming out at, your wastage and all the rest of kind of things, and your rotation in terms of where you're at in terms of the grass, how long should be the rotation, how much surface it'll take, and all of that. Other aspects to consider: just coherent subdivisions and tactics with cleaner mobs and trade stock and things like that. They come out far more economical than using tractors and lots of manpower. But a lot of the time that is compensation management, and it's keeping a lot of people alive. Might not be you. Managing livestock in buildings takes a great deal more time, a huge amount more time than running on well-managed pastures. It takes so little time to just walk towards a gate, and they're all getting up and thinking, oh, cool, this is the best bit of the day. They walk through it, you get a perfect inspection, you're finished. Managing stock and pasture well, it's important to realise, I think it's fun, I think it's the best sport that's ever been invented. It's brain work, it's observation, it's punctuality is very important, and it's discipline. Just a few tips: don't engage in grazing management with a spare wheel kind of approach. Learn to associate profit to plant and pasture soil husbandry. Allow the animals to teach you and advise you. Trust what residuals try to tell you. Foster your curiosity. Don't spend money and consider if you haven't got the rest under your control, because you're just paying somebody else to wait for it to come back. And don't stop weighing. Don't drive blind. That's for Trevor. And my last little thought was just, it reminded this whole thing coming to Scotland to talk on all of this reminded me of something. What is grazing management? And it's just a little Scottish anecdote. Our pasture lecturer in 1973 was a sweet Scotsman named Gillespie. He was a great guy. And one day he had us around the paddock and he asked us, so what's the first thing that you should do in grazing management? And we thought, well, we'll wait for him to tell us. And so he said, get down on your knees. And he said, look at it as if you're a cow or a sheep. That's your future that you're looking at. And I just thought that was marvellous, and it stayed with me. So there you go.